It is great to be down here. I will tell our folks on the panel, I was standing in the back, so make sure you pull the microphones very close to you because it is difficult to hear. It's an honor to be here. I was telling Melissa while we were driving down, you're going to love this group. It's friendly territory. It's America, coming down here. So I really look forward to be down here. It's an hour drive down. It's probably one of the nights I could go back home and be up in Bangor, but I always appreciate the opportunity to participate or just to come down and watch what's going on. Gordon asked a couple months ago, we were at one of Mary Adams' meeting, and he said, hearing a lot about Common Core, and do you think you could help us, give information, create a forum, bring some things out, and then also have an opportunity to answer questions? I said, Gordon, we'd love to do that. I want to give you just a little bit of background on how we're addressing this and why we're addressing this at the Christian Civic League, then introduce our panelists. I was hearing a lot about Common Core at the Christian Civic League. I had a lot of homeschool parents calling me and asking, what about this, what about that? And I can honestly say, I kind of dodged it for a while, and intentionally dodged it. We were involved in a lot of this probably was the greatest legislative slate that I've dealt with this last session, and was incredibly busy. And there was just a lot of information, and sometimes you would read something about Common Core from what you thought was a trusted resource, and then you'd read something else that either contradicted that, and some of the people that were talking about Common Core, I might have agreed on some issues. Some of them were kind of the tin hat, foil hat wearers that you have to be concerned about. And so I just try to avoid it, frankly. And by the time the end of May, June rolled around, the more I started looking at it when we got done our legislative session, I came to the conclusion that we just couldn't ignore this at the Christian Civic League, because part of our mission is helping the families in Maine, and we believe this is something that's very destructive to families. And so we started, as we look forward to this year, we knew that two of our big focuses were going to be Common Core and then a religious liberty bill that we're working on with Senator David Burns. So here we are. And I want to say that when I reached out to Scott Moody at the Maine Heritage Policy Center and Jonathan Haynes, it took no persuading them whatsoever when you consider Amanda, of course, her emphasis on education and so on. So we've kind of joined forces. We've met together several times talking about how to deal with this, how to be a trusted resource. There have been a lot of folks out there saying a lot of things about this, and you notice that Maine Heritage Policy Center and the Christian Civic League haven't been like way out in front with a lot of news conferences and things like that, because we've made sure that I've told Melissa, and I know Scott's been the same way with Steve and Amanda, we need to be a trusted resource. And so when someone hears something from us, they've got to make sure that it's been double and triple checked, that it's true, that it's current, that's not something that may have been true 2 years ago and no longer is an issue, so that when you're hearing it from one of us, you can trust it and you can go to the bank with it. And we'd still say, you need to check things out, but we just want you to know how that's our approach on this and every subject that we deal with. And isn't it great having a young panelist like this? America's in good hands, isn't it, to have some young, attractive people like this as resources. I'm going to introduce each one of them, and I'm going to give them a minute before we get into some questions to kind of bring us up to date on a particular aspect of Common Core, the history of it, and so on. And then I've got some questions I'm going to take to the panel, and then we want to make sure that as we go, we give you the opportunity to ask questions as well. So first of all, the troublemaker in the room, Mr. Steve Robinson, from Dexter, Maine. You've seen Steve several times. Steve's the editor of The Wire for the Maine Heritage Policy Center. Steve, welcome, and would you please share your aspect of Common Core to these folks?
The Maine Wire, you may or may not know, is the conservative news outlet for the state of Maine. We're the only news outlet in the state that has been covering Common Core. So I would encourage you to pay attention, because we will continue to cover it as developments unfold. But we really, in talking about Common Core, we decided, like Carroll said, that we really needed to pin our facts down. And one thing that I discovered is that that's incredibly difficult to do. There has been a lot of things said and a lot of deception, I think, involved in this. And one thing I think people should know is that proponents of Common Core are going to say everything is about local control still. You still have your local control. Maine's a local control state. Well, to me, that kind of sounds like you can keep your local control, period. So what I would say is if there's one big take-home message that I can give you tonight, it's that all of the terrible things that you may have heard about Common Core, all of the terrible things that you think may be happening in your classroom, those can all happen with or without Common Core. It's all about the character of the men and women who are on our school boards. All of the bad things that we don't want to happen in our schools can happen even if we repealed Common Core, they can happen. So it's about exerting local control of the school board. So the men and women in this room being on school boards, and we really need to take over those school boards, because right now the people who are sympathetic to Common Core are the people who control our institutions. But the Common Core, so the genesis of Common Core is, it's more than 100 years old. The idea that we need to have some kind of national education system really began with John Dewey and the progressive movement. But more recently, you have something called the Council of Chief State School Officers that was formed, as well as the National Governors Association. So there's nothing in the Constitution that allows them to take over, that allows the federal government to take over education. So in order to sidestep this, what they did is they had these two national groups that purport to represent the states come together to draft these standards. And they did it with a $35 million grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Some of you might be familiar with a guy named Bill Gates. So he's very committed to education and decided he had $35 million to spare for this project. They also got a lot of money through the Recovery Act, this gigantic stimulus. I mean, who didn't get money from the Recovery Act, to be honest?
I did.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody in this room, big surprise. So they got a significant amount of money, and they went to work trying to draft these standards. And one of the things they did is they got together a panel of academics who were going to look over these standards and validate them. And just recently, there was a woman named Sandra Stotsky who was on the validation committee, and she spoke down in Saco, Maine, at an event that we also covered at the Maine Wire. There's a video on the Maine Wire that you can go see. I'll put it up on the homepage tonight, but you can go there and listen to her talk. So she was involved in the development of these standards, and she now thinks that they're worthless and that it was a disaster, and she refused to validate them, and she lays out a case for why they are not good standards, and Amanda will talk a little bit about that. So I guess the key thing to know about the genesis of these standards is that people are going to say that they were developed by the states. I would ask them to point to one single person in the state of Maine who had some say in the development of the standards, because you won't be able to find one. These weren't locally designed. They weren't designed by the states. It was a national group that really told states, here, this is what you're going to have to learn. The standards themselves aren't that controversial. If you look at them, Amanda has the standards printed off here. There, a kindergartner needs to know that a period ends a sentence, that letters make up words, and that a space denotes, different words. But the key is that the standards determine the curriculum, and because the standards are what the teachers are going to be teaching to. And there's also this element of testing companies. So you have the standards are one problem, and then the testing is another problem. So once we signed on with Common Core, we joined something called the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. And Smarter Balance is going to be designing the tests that we're going to be taking. And anyone who's gone through high school knows that if you're going to be taking this big test, the advanced placement test, for example, your teacher is going to teach you to prepare you for that test. So she's going to teach you about things likely to be on that test. So Smarter Balance, another just national group that no one knows about, a nonprofit that's received lots of taxpayer money, is going to be developing these tests that every student in Maine is going to be having to take. It was going to be 4 times a year, but now they've moved it back to 1 time a year. And so when they say that, Common Core, it's not a curriculum, it's just standards. I don't know how many times I've heard that from people in the Department of Education. It's just standards. We have local control. No, the standards determine the questions. The questions determine the curriculum. So don't let them tell you that these aren't passing on a curriculum. I mean, my 7-year-old niece's textbook says Common Core on it in block letters. Don't tell me that it's not a curriculum and that it's not a textbook. But I guess that's all I'll say for now, and I'll just let them talk. I don't want to eat up too much of the time, but just remember, all the bad stuff that you think is going to happen because of Common Core can happen without Common Core. We need to have good, virtuous people on school boards in order to make sure that our schools are good.
That's right. Amanda Clark is the educational analyst for the Maine Heritage Policy Center, and certainly this has been on her radar for a while. So Amanda, just share some of your thoughts initially about Common Core.
Sure. I'm Amanda Clark, and as Steve had started to explain, my big dream and the big dream at MHPC is for every child to be able to enroll in the school or curriculum that best meets their needs and interests. Because at the end of the day, even without Common Core, our current school model needs to be revamped. In the meantime, we do recognize that Common Core is not aligned at all with our values and is very much infiltration of the federal government into our schools and into our homes. You may have heard of Common Core referred to as race to the middle, rotten to the core, and even Obama Core. I think today is actually a timely occasion to be discussing Common Core with this morning's release of the 2013 Nations Report Card. Several of you may have seen that Maine results for the 4th graders and 8th graders in reading and math, over half of those results are at basic or below basic. The 2 levels above that are proficient and advanced.
Can you speak up a little, Amanda? I'm sorry.
Sure. Is my microphone not on?
Yeah, just get right up close to it.
Put it right in your mouth. It's not very powerful.
There you go. There you go.
All right. Is that better?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so the 2013 Nation Report Card was released this morning, the results. Maine's 4th graders and 8th graders in reading and math, the majority of them are at basic or below basic achievement levels. The achievement levels above that are ranked as proficient and advanced. And nevertheless, Maine is considered to be above average when you compare us to the rest of the nation. So just interesting tidbit as we're discussing standards. Additionally, our neighbor, the Bay State, Massachusetts, is still enjoying the fruits of locally developed standards put in place following their state's 1993 landmark education reform law, having again this year scored 1st place in all 4 categories, so 4th grade and 8th grade reading and math, for the 5th time in a row. Massachusetts was the first state to accomplish this in 2005. However, their success is likely to be short-lived given the recent adoption of Common Core standards in 2010. So you have a couple of handouts in front of you. If you'd like some extras, we do have extras. One of them is a colored matrix that recaps what Steve started to get into about how Common Core has been initiated and how it's funded. And then the second handout shows you what's happening with Common Core in other states. And obviously in Maine, we're still waiting for reality to sink in. So I wanted to show to you just so you can see how thick these standards are. These, for example, are the English standards. This does include an appendix, which offers exemplary texts and model lessons as well. But as you can see, it's pretty thick, pretty detailed, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, English standards for K through 12. So all Maine classrooms must comply by these standards starting this school year, 2013 to 2014.
And just to be clear, if you talk with a bureaucrat at the Department of Education, these are no longer the Common Core standards. These are the Maine learning results.
Yes, these were adopted as a chapter, if you will, an addition or an update is how they phrase it, to the Maine learning results that were established several years back. So, of course, there's nothing wrong with having a rubric or a way to measure achievement, but I'm afraid Common Core standards actually do far more than set the bar. Common Core standards are government intrusion, top-down, one-size-fits-all coercive approach. You can find out more at corestandards.org and www.maine.gov at the DOE website. Common Core as well. They're exactly the same standards you can compare on the federal website and on the state website. Additionally, for 3 reasons, the quality of Common Core standards is subpar. So first, the Common Core standards are essentially an experiment. They're not internationally benchmarked as proponents would have you believe. At the end of the English standards, which I just held up to you, it's noted that the authors consulted Ireland, Finland, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the UK. However, we want to be up there with Massachusetts, whose foreign-ranking competitors in past years have included Singapore, Korea, and Japan.
That's South Korea.
Yeah.
South Korea. Thank you. So,
I don't think Dennis Rodman's into Common Core.
no. So there's a recent Harvard study that revealed Massachusetts class of 2011 ranked number 9 when compared to foreign countries and other U.S. states for proficiency in math. So with locally developed standards, the Bay State top countries including Japan, Canada, and Germany. Maine, on that same scale, was ranked number 53, determined to have peers including the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. So we should really be looking to other states' proven local standard models rather than the Common Core standards. Secondly, out of the 3, Common Core standards and assessments drive a dictated curriculum. Their national roots, combined with a national development of assessments aligned with those standards, beg for the natural insertion of an aligned national curriculum. I found this really fascinating just to go back and see how the Common Core standards have evolved over time prior to me even being aware of them. In 2009, presenting at the National Conference of State Legislators, Bill Gates said, "This is encouraging, but identifying common standards is not enough. We'll know we've succeeded when the curriculum and the tests are aligned to these standards." He continued saying, Secretary Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests, next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core, which of course are on the horizon for our students here in Maine. So although no full-fledged curriculum has been mandated in Maine, public school teachers must align their curriculum with the standards, which do dictate to a degree how subjects should be presented and taught. So Steve was referring to a textbook that his niece has that says Common Core. So they're not inherently Common Core curriculum, but they're textbooks that are calling themselves aligned to the Common Core. And you can in fact go to your local Books A Million and find an entire bookshelf dedicated to Common Core. So check it out. Third and finally, Common Core standards emphasize soft 21st century skills like global awareness, media literacy, and cross-cultural flexibility at the expense of academic content. Jim Milgram, a colleague of Sandra Stotsky, of whom Steve had spoken, he's a professor of math at Stanford University, the only mathematician on the National Common Core's Validation Committee. He also refused to sign off on the standards, and he described them as having very low expectations that would put our American children a year behind international students by 5th grade and 2 years behind by 7th grade. One major fault, for example, with the Common Core track is that Algebra 1 will be taught in high school rather than 8th grade. So there's no way to be ready for college when you need to take Algebra 2, geometry, trig, calculus, and never mind a statistics and probability class if you're endeavoring to be a scientist or go into the medical field. Massachusetts, in fact, already has had to reduce their teaching of classical literature by more than half in order to accommodate informational text readings. These Common Core standards rely on something that they're referring to as a quote-unquote close reading approach. You'll find it emphasized throughout the standards. An approach to literature which forces students to answer text-dependent questions without any historical context or background knowledge. And I'm going to leave you with an example of how this close reading approach is encouraged. You can find this at achievethecore.org. And you can see page 3 of Common Core Unit, a close reading approach of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, written by Student Achievement Partners, which was founded by 3 leading authors of Common Core standards, ironically, and whose mission it is to effectively implement the standards. So the instructions say, this close reading approach forces students to rely exclusively on the text instead of privileging background knowledge, and levels the playing field for all students as they seek to comprehend Lincoln's address. You can look this up on page 3, and there's just a strong sense of relativism and this attempt to make everyone essentially a number and have no sense of unique individual characteristics or the ability to build upon their personal experiences. And just as an added tidbit, David Coleman, who was a leading author of the Common Core Standards, who is also the executive director of Achieve the Core, also happens to be president of the National College Board, which in the end prepares you for college and has influence over the PSATs and SATs. So just interesting to see how many fingers and hands are dipping into this Common Core. And so Melissa, I believe, is going to talk with you a little bit about how Common Core will influence private school students and homeschooling families.
Melissa Weisberg is the new Public Policy Director for the Christian Civic League. She came on board with us in August. Thank you, Penny. Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, new is the key word. I just started this job and I kept hearing about Common Core, and I was telling another group that I thought it was like the Peace Corps. I had no idea it was education, so I've kind of immersed myself in learning about this for the past few months. But I was a former teacher at a private school in Virginia and Colorado. So when I looked at Common Core, I was really concerned with how is it going to affect private schools and homeschools. So I guess I kind of want to start with a question, and that is, how many of you have children or grandchildren or something at private schools or homeschools? Okay. All right, good. So this will be good information. As of now, Common Core is only being imposed on the public schools, but it is going to impact private schools, Christian schools, and homeschools. And there's a number of ways, and I'll get into that in just a second, but let me just say, too, it may impact them differently. I got an email today from somebody who said, well, I'm a principal of a Christian school, and we haven't had much to do with Common Core, but there are going to be avenues through which Common Core will impact private schools and homeschools. One of them, and this was sort of just touched on with Amanda, is that all of these tests, the SATs, GED, the ACT, they're all being aligned to Common Core. So if you have your homeschool students, or if you have a private school student taking those tests, they're going to have to know what's in Common Core to take those tests. So that's one way it's going to impact private schools and homeschools. The other way is curriculum. As Amanda was talking about, there's going to be all this curriculum that is aligned, and I can give you a website if you go to, there's somebody compiling a list of every single curriculum that she can get her hands on to find out if it's aligned to Common Core. And that website is theeducationalfreedomcoalition.org. Do you want me to repeat that? Yeah. Theeducationalfreedomcoalition.org. And that's being updated constantly so that you can see which curriculum is being aligned. But those are the two primary ways that Common Core is going to impact private school students and homeschool students. And there's the potential for a lot of other ways. There's been talk in the federal government about hinging Title I funding. Any school that gets those kind of students, whatever, may have to adhere to Common Core standards. College admissions requirements. The people behind Common Core are really trying to push colleges to change their admissions requirements so that students entering those colleges would have to have a Common Core aligned curriculum, basically. So those are all the potential ways that Common Core could impact homeschool and private schools.
I would say that one of the frustrating aspects of this, I remember when we've addressed this issue at the beginning, there's so many conservatives that were involved in this. And as you know, in 2010, after the revolution here in Maine, one of the first bills that was passed, and our legislators were sold a bill of goods by our Department of Education. They signed on, and as Steve said, they took our learning results and basically they were switched out for the Common Core standards. And so now as they refer to the Maine learning results, that was done by a Republican-dominated, legislature. But they were. I think they were deceived. I really think they were. There was something new. The federal government was doing what it usually does. It was dangling money in front of, just like they did with Medicare and things like that. They were also offering exemptions to No Child Left Behind and so on. So, and then when they look, you see Mitch Daniels in Indiana was involved with this, and Jeb Bush was involved with this in Florida. So when you would approach some of these folks that can't be the experts on everything, they really can't. They rely upon folks in the good information. They'd say, well, what about Florida? What about Indiana? And it was really hard to get people to say, listen, we're with you. We're conservatives, but this is going to kill us. This is very, very dangerous. And as you look at the map that Amanda handed out, some of those places like Indiana and Georgia and Florida where this was really big, the citizens have raised up and taken their educational process back away from the federal government and put it back in the state, and frankly, even on a more local level than the state. So I think one of the important parts about this, there is this speak amongst the people that push this like it's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And so you might as well just go along with it because you're not going to get the money and your kids aren't going to go to college. But I think each state that stands up shows that this isn't inevitable and we're not going to have to deal with this if we wake up and do what needs to be done as local citizens and let even your conservative legislators and governors and things know that how dangerous this really is. Steve, you were going to say something to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say I guess forgot to mention exactly how this came into Maine, but if there's some people who are interested in looking up the bill itself, and I can kind of explain why this was done on the sly. In April of 2010, we passed LD 1800, an act to adopt Common Core state standards initiative, and that was during the tail end of the Baldacci administration. But that was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
As emergency.
Yeah, as emergency legislation, and then in the very beginning of the LePage administration, the final nail in the Common Core coffin, if you will, was a major substantive rule change. So it wasn't a bill itself; it was just a regulatory change, and so that's why it kind of escaped public notice at the time, and by and large, people didn't know a lot about this at all. It's really only gained steam as people like Michelle Malkin and Glenn Beck have started digging into it. And that's been beneficial because we know about it now, but it's also been branded as, well, only the black helicopter, tinfoil hat wearing people are objecting to Common Core, and there is a lot of that. There's a lot of unwarranted skepticism and conspiracy theories about it, but there's also a lot of it is true, and that's one of the things that we hope to be able to cut through tonight. So I'm sure you guys have probably heard a lot of things about Common Core, and the three of us have been on many conference calls doing lots of research, so hopefully we can answer your questions tonight. I would say that as far as a good note, something positive to look at is the state of Indiana. Indiana passed a bill. It was a pause bill. What they said is, okay, we've already come just so far with Common Core. What we're going to do is stop. We're not going to implement it any further. We're not going to repeal anything just yet. We're going to sit down, take a breather, and see if we can find better standards. Can we improve these standards? Do we have any flexibility? What can we do? What's best for the kids? And that's something that we would recommend. Certainly MHPC would recommend that the legislature do. But at this point, if nothing else happens, Common Core is going to become the law of the land, and testing will begin next year.
And the story behind Indiana is two moms basically would not give it up. And they just persistently and persistently and persistently raise these issues, and then in a great amount of work and get the ear of their local legislators, and finally, and we're able to turn back, like I said, a horrible mistake by Mitch Daniels and Tony Bennett, who eventually got thrown out of Indiana and wound up down in Florida, I guess now, that working in that. So there
And then
have
got
been...
thrown out again.
Not in Florida.
Oh, he's out of Florida now too? Okay, because I heard he wound up with Rick Scott down there. And if you talk to the people down in Florida, Jeb Bush is very well thought of, but this is a vulnerability for him right now. They are greatly scrutinizing what's going on in regard to the educational process in Common Core, and people thought it was a done deal in Florida, and it is by no means. One other thing that I would like to talk about from a philosophical base. My background's education history, and taught writing for many, many years, taught literature for many years, and one of the approaches, of course, the reason they've gone after English standards and math standards is because they're philosophically innocuous. Not to me, they're not, but I guess to the other people they are. They tried this back in 1998 with the history standards and social studies, and it came out to the evil white European, you know, that whole deal. And these are the same people. It was an absolute disaster in 1998, and they got incredible pushback because it was a stretch on their part philosophically. So the very same people said, okay, well, let's go after the math and the English standards because there's really no, you know, we can't talk about the evil white Europeans. And so, but it's the same money, it's the same people behind that. That's why we need to be so careful about that. But one of the emphasis is within the literature and the writing is the nonfiction emphasis. And I don't know if all three of you just want to talk about that a little quickly, but just talk about kind of like this proletariat, if I may say, approach to education, away from classic, away from fiction, into the nonfiction emphasis. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, the English language arts standards mandate 50% nonfiction informational text, 50% literature. Anyone who's familiar with a primary school or a middle school curriculum even knows that it's always been literature heavy. You know, the nonfiction texts are something that comes much later, and young education specialists say that, you know, this helps develop creativity and critical thinking and the imagination. And as Sandra Stotsky put it recently, the English language arts standards in the curriculum, we're training our students not to be the next, you know, aerospace engineers, but to be the janitors. And what they want is they want workers who can read an informational manual. They want workers who can read manuals, write manuals, and really do things that don't require a lot of creativity and imagination. And so they're going to be training people to do the type of reading that you would need maybe to learn how to, you know, design a website or do computer programming or something like that. We're not looking at training a next generation of great novelists or writers, or really giving people I guess the experiences that can lead them to determine what they want to do with their lives. We're trying to pre-program them to be little cogs in a wheel.
As administrator of school, I used to say it. Now, granted, it was a Christian school, so we had a little, you know, a little bit more focused on why we were there. But I have always very much repulsed against the idea that education is about preparing people just for jobs. Education is to teach you to think and to reach your potential. And I remember as a second and third grader, our second and third grade teachers tell us how they educated people in Russia. You know, that they prepared them to be this, they prepared them to be that. And I really believe that's what's a lot behind here, that we have to be. Deb, Representative Sanderson, sorry.
That's okay,
Just
that's
Debbie.
okay. I just have tonight I went to, before coming here, my daughter's parent-teacher conference. And the teacher made a comment that I'm going to quote to you, and I would like to hear your reaction, because you guys have touched on the testing and what's going to be in the testing and how the testing is going to be. But during our conference tonight, Jamie's teacher said, and I quote, "Common Core testing is designed so 50% of students will fail." What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think that reflects what we saw in New York when the standards were first adopted, is that especially in younger classrooms, so I guess the standards are just poorly designed, is what it gets down to. They're too tough for young kids. The testing is far too rigorous for young kids. I mean, elementary education professionals, youth psychologists, they all say that these are just too rigorous for young kids. But then on the other side of the scale, they're too soft on high school and older middle school kids, because they're not preparing them for college. They're really delaying higher level math skills and stuff like that. So I would say that I don't know if they're designed so half of the kids will fail, but that will certainly be what comes about when the testing starts occurring. And one of the reasons why this is important is because the Common Core testing, some of you may be familiar with Governor LePage's effort to grade schools, giving them an A through F grade. Well, starting next year, those grades are going to be determined by the Common Core testing. And these schools are now set up in a situation where if they want to give test questions, Common Core aligned practice test questions. I mean, it's just common sense. You have practice test questions, you do better on the test. You practice basketball, you're going to be better at shooting foul shots. They have to go to Common Core aligned test question providers and buy test questions out of their budgets, out of property tax money spent on these Common Core line test question providers in order to have them for their students. So you're putting a superintendent in a position where they need to spend money on a Common Core aligned vendor in order to boost their test score to raise the grade level that their school gets. So there's a lot of money involved, and the testing. Another element of it is it's heavily geared towards technology and computers, and there's going to be some costs there. I think the discussion about laptops in the classroom is probably for another night. But one of the things you see in the Portland School District right now is that the teachers have no way to control what content the students are accessing with their iPads and their laptops. And naturally, kids being kids, they're going to the nasty parts of the internet, and the teachers have no way to stop them from doing that or finding out. So there's costs and risks to having a technology-dependent testing going on, and there's no question that there's a potential for adverse effects on kids.
Melissa, could you address the financial aspect of what happened in Georgia and how that led them into getting out of that? Do you have that information available?
I do. I just wanted to say one other thing, and this sort of goes back. I don't know if this answers your question about preparing kids to fail or 50% of kids to fail, but as far as like the race to the middle and that sort of thing, I think that's the nature. That's what happens when you have just one common standard. I mean, I think anybody who's been in a classroom knows that sometimes if you've got kids way up here and kids way down here, you end up teaching to the middle, and so it's just sort of the nature of the beast. When we say there's one common standard, that's what's going to happen. There's going to be kids that are going to be so bored because the standard's too low, and there's going to be other kids that are going to struggle. So I don't know if that addresses that, but I think that's the nature.
I just really wanted your reaction on that comment that came out of my fifth grade teacher's, my daughter's fifth grade teacher's mouth. Mm-hmm. And when we're dealing in mediocrity and we talk about dumbing down, our students, it just, I think she just put it out there in a no hold, no nonsense kind of way, and I don't think it's too far from the truth.
So, can I just say, I was on the education committee when we were doing the MEAs and the former learning results. When we were doing that assessment, and it changed, it evolved over the years, but there were 75% of the kids in Maine not meeting the standard under the old learning results. So if we're at 50, that means we're better. How do you figure out?
And another thing is, in talking with teachers about this, I've got a lot of teachers in my family. I've found that a lot of them are worried about a lack of control over their classrooms, but they're going to these workshops every once a month or once every 2 months, and they're really getting talking points handed down to them from the Obama administration, frankly, and so they're being conditioned to think the way the administration wants them to think about this initiative. So, you don't take. I'm not going to say don't trust anything a teacher says, but take it with a grain of salt.
I would say that one of the things that I can't remember which one of our panelists mentioned, but they talked about having to work with Common Core vendors. One of the false thinking, whether it's intentional or not, when you talk to people and say how dangerous it is. Well, they say, well, let's just take the good parts of it. We're all for high standards, so we'll take the parts that we think that are, necessary, and then, kind of chew the meat and spit out the bones. But I don't know if any of you want to address this, but these are trademarked, owned. These are not federal in that regard. People own these. These two consortiums they talked about, they own these standards. And when you sign on, as I understand, you basically sign an agreement that you can't change these, or you can change them very little. So I don't know if anybody wants to address that, but I remember hearing that as well.
Do you want me to talk about the cost really fast?
Sure.
Oh.
Yeah, talk about the Georgia
Okay.
thing, and then, because I know that they're also one of the
Yeah.
ones that talked about the percentage of change as well.
Yeah, just one tiny fact figure for you. I talked to somebody from Georgia because Georgia, they were not part of Smarter Balance. They were part of the other testing consortium. And one of the things that swayed voters and swayed people in Georgia to get out of that was the cost. And I can just tell you that the whole testing budget, the annual testing budget in Georgia before Common Core had been $27 million. And when they looked at what it was going to cost to go to the testing with Common Core, that was going to be $56 million. So when people in Georgia found that out, they said, okay, we're not doing it. So I know the cost will be significant. I don't know what Maine's cost of testing per student was before now, but I know according to Smarter Balance, it's $27.30 per student now. And I don't know what Maine's budget was before.
So these consortiums are gonna get this money.
Oh, yes. There's a lot of money to be made in this. Imagine that, Bob.
Just one thing I would address about the what Carroll was saying about the statements being trademarked in Indiana, where, like I said, they passed pause legislation. There were some lawmakers who incorrectly asserted that, well, we can just change these standards. If we don't think they're tough enough, we'll just make them tougher. And a woman from the Fordham Institute, and the Fordham Institute is actually pro-Common Core, she had to correct the lawmakers and say, no, not so fast. You can't change these. It's either the Common Core or nothing. And I've done research into how much Common Core is going to cost, and actually talked with Solomon Millett, who is a very good conservative. He's been in the trenches for a while and knows where the bodies are buried.
Definitely.
But Solomon could not tell me how much the transition to Common Core costs because there's so much local involvement in it. And so in order to determine the full scope of it, you would have to really coordinate with all of the superintendents in the state of Maine to figure out how much it's cost. But I think, what is Jamie's estimate? Is
$85 million.
Yeah, Jamie's estimate is about $85 million for the state of Maine. And
That doesn't include testing,
yeah, but that doesn't include testing.
just
Okay.
implementing.
But one other thing is that this is kind of one of the arguments in favor of the testing consortia is that there's an economy of scale if you have a test in common with all different kinds of states. Like the kneecap, for example, is a bunch of New England states who all get together and have a similar test. And states save money because you're all using the same test and you have an economy of scale. So what people will argue is that, well, if we don't have the Common Core standards, then what? We're going to have more expensive tests. So, I mean, that's one argument that conservatives, especially, fiscal Tea Party conservatives, are going to have to deal with is, are we willing to spend more money to have tests that are actually locally controlled? Because getting back to this local control thing, is there anybody in this room who helped write the Common Core test questions? Is there anybody in the state of Maine who helped write the Common Core test questions? I mean, the company's from Washington State. The local control has really gone out the window here.
Penny.
I have two questions, but I'll just throw them out. One is, what happens, what happens if homeschoolers don't pass the test? Is this linked to Agenda 21? And the third one was, I forgot.
Well, I would say that you don't have to worry about homeschoolers not passing the test. I think they're going to blow it out of the water. What I think you find is that the Common Core curriculum, it's not like there's going to be something different that they haven't learned about. It's going to be far, far below the caliber of education that they get. They'll probably finish the test with 30 minutes to spare. And
I think that's true in regard to math and math, and English. My concern would be as we move forward and this creeps into other more philosophically vulnerable issues, then I think that's where folks like Christian schools, private schools, and homeschools are going to have a real concern in that regard.
And I don't think it's not creeping into science; it's leaping into science.
Right.
They're already working on the next generation science standards, and these are going to be really controversial. And like Carroll said, they tried to do the history standards, but that was a miserable failure. So they went after math and language arts, which for some people is less controversial. Science is probably the most controversial because when you're setting out the standards, you're really going to be determining what should kids know about the origins of the universe. What should kids know about the origin of man? Should any respect be given to the idea that maybe God had a role in it? And I think given the way education has trended over the last few decades, we know exactly what role God's going to have in the classroom. Yeah. A very small one.
And especially the toleration issues and so on. Just what
What's it gonna take to get rid of it? Because from what I hear from Heidi Sampson, there are so many layers that an executive order can't do it. We need legislation to address it.
Scott and I have talked about this quite a bit, and I agree that probably the only way that and the fastest way that we can stop it is a legislative action. The governor's executive order, while we appreciate it and showed, certainly a strong statement for local control, and we haven't even got into the sexiest part of this, and that's the whole data mining and the information that's being gathered.
Sexy is not a very good word for it.
Yeah, but it's definitely what people want to hear about. None of his statements, his executive order, really address those issues, and they certainly don't address it if he's not reelected. So those are grave concerns. I don't know what's going to happen. It's not going to happen in this session unless the governor brings forth a bill, which could be a possibility, and especially with the momentum we're seeing, or the lack of momentum, but the momentum building against Common Core, that's a possibility. But it will have to be a legislative solution or a referendum as late as 2016. There's no way there's going to be a 2014.
And Heidi Sampson is collecting, I guess Heidi Sampson's not the one collecting signatures, but she is doing an educational campaign about it. You can go to No Common Core Maine and get more information about it. And there is going to be a petition drive to gather signatures and get a referendum to repeal Common Core. But I would submit that it's not as simple as just repealing Common Core, because we're going to have standards. No one is arguing that we shouldn't have standards. We should have tough standards that are locally determined. And just to give you an example, a local control would be something in the standards that says you have to study Maine history. Something that says you have to know about the Native American tribes that were in Maine, or the colonization of the Maine coastline, or local authors in Maine. That's not in the standards. That's what local control would be, and we don't have that.
If I could just clarify something too, then we'll take questions in regard to the governor's statement about that no information gathered, because we're gathering that information now and have been gathering it, but even though it's going to be on steroids after this, would be shared with the federal government or with the Department of Education. And it's really a shell game, because we're collecting that information now, but the contract that we have with Smarter Balance is the Smarter Balance Consortium, not the margin. We're under contract with them. We have to give them the data that's being collected on our young people. Then they turn around and they're under contraction to give it to the federal government. So we aren't giving it to them, but we're in a contractual agreement with someone that is. So it's really a paper tiger in that regard.
I met with the former education commissioner, Steve Bowen, and asked him about data collection, and he said that data collection's been going on for a long time, and the state government keeps it locally, and Common Core doesn't expand it that much. But if you look at the memorandum of understanding that Carroll is talking about, signed with Smarter Balance, it explicitly says that data collection is going to be happening, and Smarter Balance is obligated to give that data to the United States Department of Education. Following up on this and investigating it, I got in touch with someone at the Department of Education here in the state of Maine, and I said, What about this memorandum of understanding and data collection? Is Smarter Balance going to scrub this information of personal identifiers before they give it to the Department of Education? Meaning, are we going to take out social security numbers and things that could be used to identify a young person? And she said yes. But what she implied in saying yes is that Smarter Balance is going to have the personal identifiers. So it's a big national group that's going to have the personal identifiers. And so I got back to her and I said, so just to be clear, you're telling me that Smarter Balance is going to have those personal identifiers? And she said, no. The Department of Education here in Maine is going to scrub those personal identifiers before we give it to Smarter Balance. So that's just an example of some of the trouble that I've gone through trying to get a straight answer from people involved in Common Core. And if there's anything you can say is just look at what's going on right now with Edward Snowden's leaks and data and information. If you think that just scrubbing a file of personal identifying information can prevent them from combining two databases and figuring out which person that information corresponds with, I mean, you're dreaming. And another thing is that the information that they're collecting has nothing to do with education. They're talking about when was your child held back? When did they miss a day for school? Were they sick? Where did they get picked up by the bus? Well, do they have allergies? Do they have medical conditions? What's their religion? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of information that they're going to be gathering, and this gets back to the original reason why Common Core came about, which was you had all these different testing regimes and no way to compare a student from Maine with a student from California. So, the smart bureaucrats in DC want a way to look at all the students and say, well, what makes for a good educational outcome? So they're craving, it's almost, they want the data. Common Core came about because they want that data. They want to be able to analyze kids like a scientific experiment and trying to determine what's going to make the best workers.
All right, we get a lot of questions. Carrie? Go ahead, Carrie.
A couple things. First of all, money, is that what is contributing to the Department of Education threatening the state if they don't go along? What is, I guess my question is, what do they hold over each state or each community? Is it the money?
It was No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. It was a waiver. In order to get a waiver from the onerous requirements of No Child Left Behind, you had to adopt standards. They could either be the Common Core standards or they could be a group of standards that are in common with other states. So they basically set it up to say if you want to get away from the No Child Left Behind, you have to approve these standards. And then there was additional money with Race to the Top, which came through the Recovery Act.
Okay, so in the state of Maine, as an example, are we at the state, because I know the state does not have a lot of money, but are we at the stage in this state and within our communities that we are being forced to adopt these and go along with it because of the money that's coming in?
Enticed, I'd say, rather than enforced.
I would say strongly enticed.
We don't do it. What power do they have over us if it's not the money? What else can they do? This is the federal government telling Warren or Topsom what they have to do. And somebody has got to say, no, this is not what we want. So I guess my question is, who enforces this? Is it solely upon the amount of money that we're getting to the state, and we're doing this stuff because of that?
Yes, it wasn't coerced explicitly, but it was an offer we couldn't refuse.
But what happens, and maybe Deb can answer this, what happens if we don't accept the money? What is going to happen? If we decide to write our own
standards.
Yeah, and do it on a state and not the federal. What's going to happen if we don't accept that money?
Well, I would say nobody's had the, as the good Senator Hamper says, testicular fortitude to put it to the test.
Okay, well, my point...
And, I'm not sure what would happen. I know that the federal government on many levels, with the Department of Health and Human Services, with the Department of Education, a lot of the things that we have grown as a state and for programming is heavily reliant on that federal reimbursement.
I understand, and that's part of the problem.
And if they say we're going to pull all that out,
Yep.
you're not going to have anybody who's going to have the spine except for maybe a few, who are gonna say, do it.
Now, you say spine, are you talking legislators?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
And they need to hear from you. I mean, that's,
They need to hear from you guys.
and I would say too that, remember, look at the proclivity in the last 3 or 4 years of this country. I mean, pass Obamacare, then read it. And I'm not trying to be funny. 44 states immediately signed on to this. And then they find out what it is, because we've been in this difficult, desperate situation financially. And so this, as strong as those forces are, then our resistance has to be as strong to it. And that's why it is so important that we make sure that when we make the case with our neighbors and our legislators, that our information be valid, correct information, so that it doesn't validate the real concerns here that we should be concerned, that we need to bring forth and raise. Yes, sir, in the back.
Where does the standards-based education philosophy and Common Core meet?
It's for standards referenced.
Right. I think overall they have the same theme in that they're dictating or wanting to dictate the results of student achievement and learning. Proficiency-based education, from my understanding, eliminates any grades in terms of you earned an A, you earned a B. It also has multi-age level classrooms. So again, a similar worldview or similar philosophy to Common Core in trying to eliminate that unique personality or character, skills, strengths, and weaknesses of each individual student.
And that's not true necessarily on the ground level. I mean, there's some people that are involved in Common Core that they recognize, they would agree with us on a bunch of educational levels in regard to the need for standards and being rigorous and things like that. So that's what makes us a little confusing, but there's no question in my mind that what Amanda's referring to, that this egalitarian approach to saying, like the Lincoln thing that she talked about, that, you know what she's saying, that some kid that's coming in from another country or so on, they don't know about Abraham Lincoln. So the kid that's grown up with it and has heard about Abraham Lincoln has this advantage over this other student, and that's not fair. So let's just do this rather than saying, no, let's bring this kid up to speed, you know. Maire.
How would the data mining apply to homeschoolers and private school, Christian school?
That's a good question.
How would the data mining affect homeschoolers and private schools?
At this point, there's no evidence that private school students or homeschoolers would be in these data systems, but there is talk of it. There was a conference in 2011 sponsored by the Council of Chief State School Officers, and they got together with data people all over the country, and there was a group there from Oklahoma that said we need to start including, and by the way, they're advising all these other people that have come to this. They said we need to start including groups that have not traditionally been included in these data systems, and that includes, and they specifically referenced homeschoolers. So there's at least talk of it across the country. And the other thing I would say is, if you have a homeschool child and maybe they take a class, like an algebra class at a public school, and then they do the corresponding testing, because it's really through the testing, that's where the data mining is coming from. So if you have a student, maybe that's a homeschooler, but they're taking one class at a public school, then their information could be in that data system.
And in some instances, parents can choose to opt out of the data mining. So I would talk with your principal and see what that is. And I mean, even then, who knows if you can trust them or not. But you do have a limited ability to opt out of certain data collection. So it is worth investigating.
You don't have to give them your child's social security.
Yeah.
Right. Never give your child social security number. Ma'am?
Distant